power system stabilizers were developed back in the 70s in order to counteract, the effects that we get when you have an SMIB model. That's a single machine infinite bus. So I have my my rotating machine at my power plant, and it's connected to a purely simplified model of the grid as an ideal voltage source. I can analyze the harmonics there, stabilize that system, and then because every individual machine is pretty well stabilized, and you don't have two power plants all right next to each other. Doing that, we've developed a fairly stable grid, but all of a sudden comes all these additional rotating masses, all these small natural gas turbines, all sorts of windmill machinery. And so we really can't put DC links between all these individual devices in the grids. So what you do is you have wind farms, many of them like in Oklahoma, that are now resonating with places like Dallas. And so you have resonances occur down these long transmission lines that's damaging major generation equipment in large cities in America. You have two different wind turbines that will resonate with one another across a transmission line.
How would they even allow it? Like, it seems like
because right, how do they even allow it? Because they haven't done the transmission studies. They don't have the grid modeled well enough to really determine that these things are going to happen. Like, why did we have major blackouts in the Northeast recently? You have fairly simplified grid models, right? You have inductances and resistances and capacitances of transmission lines, and you have models of transformers and things. Well, the transformer models they had were based on transformers when they were built. These things degrade over their lifetime. And who is out there constantly measuring the impedance of everything on the grid and updating our model? Our ability to predict behavior is limited by the models we use to do so. Now, admittedly, they're doing their best to try to, deploy synchrophasor measurement units everywhere along the grid. The Department of Energy is working very hard to upgrade our awareness in order to even plan the appropriate transmission upgrades. But it's the awareness itself is an extremely, it's not impossible, but it will take a huge amount of effort.
When you have a plant with 4 reactors, they have to deliberately design them so they're equally...
But they have the plant model. Like, I know, okay, all these are the same. I have all my power system stabilizers designed to deal with the modes of that power plant. Not the modes that power plant shares with another power plant, right? Like, I take an RLC circuit. It has a certain number of resonances. I connect that to another circuit that has its own resonances. I will have both original resonances plus all the additional ones that come because now I have a different circuit, right? Like, it's not just the thing itself, it is the thing in its environment.
You'd far rather have a predictable energy source.
Right. Predictable in many senses. Predictable certainly from the dispatchability. When will I know it will be generating? But also predictable from I'm putting one in an area and I have it fairly well modeled, and so I know that there's probably not going to be a bunch of interactions. But when I'm putting in hundreds of turbines, hundreds of rotating masses all over the place, they aren't doing the studies for these things. They're not even making sure that there's enough transmission line capacity there to even get the power out of the Texas Panhandle. I mean, these people are not doing their due diligence. They're under a huge pressure to put green energy out there, and they leave them shut off half the time because when they get the thing up and running, it damages the local grid. It starts to burn the grid out.
Rooftop solar is actually destructive to the grid.
The Assistant Secretary of the Department of Energy's Transmission Research Group, Pat Hoffman, said as much. Feeders from Florida to Hawaii are being overloaded by home solar. And they've written the laws in such a way that the people want to put as much rooftop solar on the grid as possible. And now they're discussing taxing these people for putting power back on the grid, and no one understands why. This is, oh, you hate solar energy, why do you hate me, you're taxing me now. And it's like, sorry that you were getting like, they were basically stealing their neighbor's money. When you have a solar panel on your house, you're saying to your neighbor, hey, you owe me, you pay me whenever I want to get paid, and you give me power whenever I want it. And the money only flows one way, and it's wrong, it's stealing, it is stealing.
When a person is metered for how much they're contributing to the grid, are they done right at their home?
The meter will still really only run one way. The solar panel just, in 99% of the cases, when the solar is coming in, my meter's simply not running as much. I mean, sometimes energy is put back on the grid, but that just kind of runs the meter backwards, right? Nothing is taken into account for time of use, nothing is taken into account for, what is the voltage level on the bus that I'm putting it on. I mean, if we could even integrate simple awareness like that to where I'm allowed to put solar energy back on the grid if the voltage is below a certain level and the frequency is below a certain level, then you could say at this point in time the grid could use some more power, sure. But we just don't have that level of awareness integrated.
People at top utilities are closing a blind eye partly, do you think? Or?
So what is a utility is an organization that is very much leashed by the government. Utilities are not allowed to significantly profit, and they're also protected in case things go down. They answer to public service commissions in a lot of cases, and the Public Service Commission is a political organization that answers to what people are demanding. John Bethel with the head chair of the Arkansas Public Service Commission, great guy, and I've talked to him and he agrees with all the nuclear power stuff, but he's an elected official and his job is to give the people what they want. And when the people are deceived and are demanding bad resources, they basically come up with the least bad scenario that allows a utility company to not go bankrupt completely. I mean,
how long has this awareness of the damage to the existing grid been around? Is this like something in the last few years now that we're starting to see?
The first time we really saw subsynchronous resonance occur on the grid was when they started building power plants at coal mines and connecting them via long transmission lines to loads. So back in 70 and 71 at Mojave, they connected this power plant up to the grid, and like stuff starts shaking, and boom, the shaft of the turbine snaps, and they're like, what in the world, did the hand of God come down and do this? What's going on here? And so they actually had to go back and do the studies and say, hey, some kind of frequency of vibration is going on here. And they looked at not just the turbine and its dynamics, they looked also at the dynamics of the local grid and the capacitively coupled line, and they're like, oh hey, if you series compensate a transmission line with a large capacitor, you can increase the amount of power it can transmit. But by adding a series capacitor, I'm also introducing a resonance, and if that resonance plus the resonances, any of the resonances of the rotating machinery add up to 60 hertz, they'll interact. And so that's the thing, is when you have multiple rotating masses, any combination of those rotating masses can add up to a resonance with a series capacitively compensated line. And so basically back in the 70s, we figured out how to plan and mitigate series resonance from fossil fuel generators and series compensated lines. And that was basically a solved problem. After about the 80s, we kind of made sure when we upgraded it wasn't an issue. And now it's becoming an issue again. We're revisiting the old issues that we had solved because we're all of a sudden trying to integrate inferior energy sources, without doing the appropriate planning. In fact, wind turbines have more resonance than a typical steam or gas turbine because the blades themselves wobble in the wind. And I mean, they fatigue and break, and it's serious. A wind turbine blade will be flung miles, and a lot of times that'll be due because there was an electrical resonance with this turbine. Now, they can mitigate that by putting a AC to DC to AC conversion system on the front end of every single wind turbine. But I mean, who wants to pay for like megawatts of power electronics? Like, let's go ahead and like add another 30% of the cost of every wind turbine.
On the ground or up on the nacelle?
It'd be up on the nacelle.
I have a question. If a city wanted to plan a system where certain people that favored renewables wanted to live in a neighborhood that was powered by renewables, and then they had another part of the city that wanted, say, industry, where they always had reliable power, base load all the time. Is that a feasible, better way to plan a city?
They need two separate grids. They need one grid that has its own set of controls, right? Like, it's possible to do that, but the grid you would do that with is not this grid that we have with us today. This grid is based off the concept of unidirectional power flow from constant sources to some variation of loads. But the power flow is always unidirectional. All the protective devices on the grid, all your circuit breakers, your variable tap transformers, all these devices are controlled considering power flow in certain directions. I'm going to create a microgrid of some solar and wind and other things to power my happy residential farm community. It's doable, but you would need the controls and the systems in place that understood how to redirect power to energy storage at certain times and how to schedule, I would obviously have to do like load curtailment. These people would need to know that they should schedule their refrigeration and their air conditioning in times of power availability. I mean, a smart grid is not impossible, but the grid we have was not made to be a smart grid.
I mean, it's too late almost to say you can rebuild cities to have multiple grids.
Right, like you would want to lay one grid over top of another grid. Like, I'd want to have two sets of power lines, basically, which is like, I mean, who's going to pay for that?
It sounds like Brazil.
Oh, yeah?
Well, the movie Brazil.
Oh, right, yes, I know. Yeah, exactly. I mean, honestly, if we wanted to go solar and have it run a residential neighborhood, let's just have a DC, all DC grid, right? Like, why not just have like DC to DC converters everywhere and just go to batteries? And if it's just going to be a local neighborhood grid, I mean...
So you're saying that it would be a truly local grid if it was DC, and that would be the way you'd have to do it. You'd have to, if you were going to have... It's so like... If you read like Solartopia or something like that like Harvey Wasserman, he's a big anti-nuclear person, but he wrote this book, Solartopia, and he talked about the new grids and all that thing, but it would be a DC grid.
I really think so. If I could have a localized, relatively low voltage DC grid, if I'm not having to transmit power, I don't need to step up to hundreds of thousands of volts. When we're working at around 10,000 volts and less, we have power electronic converters that can give me bidirectional DC-DC conversion. They're small, they're modular, fairly inexpensive. It can be done, but really, the smart grid renewables folks are hurting themselves by trying to impose their grid concept onto this grid that exists now, which is an AC grid designed that way for a specific purpose. Like renewables folks, just stop compromising. If you want your own solution, go and build it separate and run off of it. Like, no one's stopping you. But to try to subvert this existing thing, you're going to destroy its original function to make it function the way you want to. Like, don't destroy one system that works fine and supplies those people that need consistent power all the time. if you really want to, sure, let's have a grid that runs hospitals and industry and whoever wants constant power, and then let's have the hippie grid. That I mean, sure, it's doable and fine. You know?
I mean, it's conceivable that new cities, have you seen what they're doing in China? They're building cities within a space of 3 years. They've got entire new cities going up with no people in them. And then they ship the people in after the city's built.
I mean, if you're gonna like build cities and factories like that functionally, well, cities aren't ever going to run off renewables. There's not enough. I mean, they're not dense enough in terms of energy collection to power a dense collection of people. I mean, you
need reliable traffic lights and reliable subway systems. And
the traffic lights in our city are only going to run a couple hours every day.
And how long have you been doing this?
About 4 years. I've really been doing power systems. I mean, I'm still in my master's program. It's really drug out, but they bring you in to like consider concepts that just really, when you think outside the box just enough, you realize it's not legitimate. You know, like I think the first thing I got brought on to do was energy storage scheduling, you know, so like let's how do we determine an algorithm for when to make sure batteries have discharged enough to accept additional energy from solar. And so it's based on predicting weather patterns and cloud cover, and you read all the papers people have written, and the functional conclusion of all this research is it's not correlated. You know, you cannot predict when the sun will shine and when it won't. At least not reliably, not with any degree of accuracy in order to base an energy storage algorithm. And you're like, okay, so they're asking me to answer these questions, but why are they asking me to answer these questions? Well, because the capacity factor of solar is really low, and there's issues. These costs aren't paying back. And then I'm like, okay, so what's the deal with renewables in general? Do they pay back? What's the deal with energy storage? Why can't we just build more batteries? Why doesn't that make sense? And then you go and you read some of the really critical reports on this, and you realize that 99.99% of energy storage in America is pumping water up and down a hill. And then you're like, oh, well, why is it that way? Well, there's things like cycle lifetime on batteries. You know, there's costs associated with manufacture. Can we recycle these batteries? You know, the cheapest electrochemistry currently is lead acid. You know, if you're not going to do it with lead acid batteries, you're certainly not going to do it with Elon Musk's lithium batteries.
Not for grids.
Not for grids.
Yeah.
Right. The devil's in the details, and you must drive him out. He is there. Anybody will sell you snake oil, I suppose. You know, there's plenty of snakes and oil to be pressed from them. So these kind of led towards me looking at, you know, how do we actually supply variable loads? Well, the cheapest method now with which we deal with the variability of energy demand and supply from renewables is natural gas turbines. And so you read and you're like, oh, I was studying energy storage, but we're never going to build energy storage because a natural gas turbine is cheaper. Like, you're going to build something that stores its energy as a chemical, because chemicals are cheaper and more energy dense and do not gradually leak out the longer you store them, unless it's hydrogen gas, and I guess that leaks out.
Your skills are going to last longer than natural gas.
Right.
So when it runs out, you're going to have to give people new advice.
Right. And natural gas is very much a temporary solution. Wind and solar would not have been built up if it were not for this natural gas boom. But as we've seen a lot recently, a lot of these wells aren't proving out. You know, certain natural gas fields they're saying, oh, we overestimated the amount of gas in this field by like a couple orders of magnitude. Whoops. And then that happens, and you're going to have a society that has invested billions of dollars in turbines and solar thermal and solar photovoltaic plants around the nation, and these things are going to sit unused as birds crap on them and as they slowly crumble to dust. You know, like who's going to recycle all the solar panels that we've put out? You know, who's going to go gather those things up and melt them down?
I mean, and then you have just everything that's in them.
There's heavy toxic metals. At least radioactive waste will decay after a certain point in time, but lead, arsenic, and cadmium are toxic infinity. They do not decay into not lead, not arsenic, and not cadmium. They're there, and they're not going anywhere.
If Merkel hired you as a consultant, what would you tell her to do to fix her country?
That's a really good question. Is like, we're going to have a lot of situations here in the next decade where you have countries trying to extricate themselves from the morass of renewables. We need to start planning for that as a society. Like, what are we going to do with these devices? I think the real heavy issue is the solar cells. What value is there in doped p-n junction silicon? I mean, like, you're gonna, sand is more valuable than this stuff in terms of turning it into computer chips.
Well, when all those towers go obsolete, they have to do something with those big tower windmills with all that metal.
We're gonna have a ton of steel to recycle. I know that. It's just, man, if we could have just built it into something useful to begin with. Oh, it breaks my heart. What a waste. There's a lot of people that starve to death because we were busy wasting money on this stuff. There's a nation of people that don't have jobs because we threw this money away instead of like building useful industries. It's a tragedy, and no one sees it. You can't see.
People do see it, but they're ignoring it.
Those that can see aren't telling the truth, and that's the tragedy. And they'll be held accountable for it one way in this life or the next. There's an accounting.